Good evening. Archbishop, Your Grace, Thabo Makgoba, Mrs. Lungi Makgoba, Vice Chancellor, Professor Sizwe Mabizela, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Peter Clayton, Dean of Commerce, Professor Dave Suri, and of course, our honored 8th speaker tonight, Ms. Busisiwe Mavuso. Great pleasure to welcome you to our 8th annual Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Development Trust annual lecture on values-based leadership. Before I introduce our speaker, I thought it would be opportune, as we are in this face-to-face lecture now after being virtual for the last 2 years, to just reflect back on the 7 speakers before and just draw on what I thought were the most profound statements that were made. So our first speaker was Advocate, now Professor Thuli Madonsela, and she highlighted the importance of Ubuntu by stating that if we push others to the edge of society, they eventually have nothing to lose if they turn against it. Professor Madonsela reminded us that we need to remind ourselves that our Constitution is our greatest heritage. The Constitution is our objective lifestyle, directing us to the South Africa which is inclusive, based on social justice, human dignity, the free potential of all persons, and the improved quality of life of all. The core of constitutional value is human dignity, which is underpinned, as the Constitutional Court said, by the value of Ubuntu. In 2016, we had former First Lady, Mrs. Graça Machel, sorry, it was former President Clement Motlanthe. And he said, in a situation of oppression, you are either a tool of oppression or an instrument of liberation. Now, for me, President Motlante's words were the most profound in terms of my own personal experience, and he highlighted a poet, Kirapetse Kokhetsile, who wrote a poem where he put past, present, future as one word, because in the words of President Motlanthe, the past continues to cast a shadow on the present unless we create a better future for all. Third annual lecture was Graça Machel, as I indicated earlier, and she highlighted the lack of collective outrage by South Africans against the rapidly escalating brutalization of women and children. And she strongly stated we have to develop a value-based society, the family, school, and religion to work together, as well as higher education institutions, so that we can salvage some structure that we can continuously build on. And she said, if you wait for leaders to do this for us, we'll be disappointed. So it really starts with us. Our 4th annual lecture in 2018, Dr. Makosi Khoza, and she said, I view the Constitution as a collective moral signature that I urge everyone to abide by and stay loyal to. In 2019, Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman said that South Africans are as good as and often better than the rest of the world. And I think he extended that to Africa as well. He says the problem is we don't believe in ourselves. The 6th annual lecture, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas in 2020, and prophetically he said things are likely to get worse before they get better. He called on all activists, leaders, and citizens globally to work towards ensuring that the country gets through the transitional period with its core values intact. He said we need to combat the politics of fear and destruction that thrives in periods of turbulence. We need new politics built around authenticity, a new moral code, and the belief that a better world is possible. We need leaders rooted in an unshakable ethical foundation to steer us through the COVID-19 pandemic, the global attack on democracy, and climate change. And then last year, former Governor Tito Mboweni said that values-based leadership should be distinguished and distinguishable from the rats and mice that masquerade as leaders in the world and eat away our future. Global leadership must be believable and trusted by people. And I'd like to call upon His Grace to just open with a prayer. Thank you, Your Grace.
Thank you so much, Professor Sky. Our sincerest apologies for arriving late. If you see an white Opel with a small biscuit tire, you must know it's the Archbishop's car, and I've tried to change that tire. So if it wiggles and we have a car accident, we'll blame not the university, but the Bishop of Bremstar. So let us pray. And so we pray for people of faith, people of no faith, people struggling with faith, and pray for all God's people. We pray that indeed we may be characterized by the values of care for creation, care for one another, and celebration of difference, and the pursuit for all that is pure, all that is noble, and for all that is good. Lord, as we gather today, we pause for a moment as we remember Siyasanga Ntlagaza, an NBA class of 2021, who sadly died at the beginning of this year. We pray that she may be numbered with the company of the redeemed in heaven, and her family be comforted, as is the class of 2021. We offer these prayers in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Your Grace. And as I saw the Grace and Mrs. Makgoba running here, I said to His Grace, I don't think he plans to give up his day job to try to get a job with the Ferrari team or the Red Bull team. And he said, definitely not. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our 8th speaker, Ms. Busisiwe Mavuso. And as I was saying to Busisiwe before we came here, this year was the easiest we've ever had. The message, email, please will you come and speak? And I instantly got a reply, yes. So thank you so much. Ms. Mavuso is a chartered certified accountant, qualified with the Association of Certified Chartered Accountants, ACCA. She holds a master's degree in business leadership from UNISA, postgraduate qualification in management from Gibbs, and a BCom in accounting from UNISA. And she's currently studying towards a PhD. She's the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, and until last week was a non-executive director on the board of Eskom. Also serves on Business Unity South Africa and Resultant Finance, a PIC investee company. She serves on the Human Resources Development Council, the Advisory Committee of the Local Government Ethical Leadership Initiative, the Alcohol Industry Advisory Board, and the Social Justice Council. And she also finds the time to be a visiting adjunct professor at the Wits Business School. She's a member of the Young Presidents Organization, the Institute of Directors of South Africa, as well as ACCA. In 2020, she was awarded the Influencer of Influencers Award by the Africa Brand Summit, and in October 2020 was named second runner-up for Business Person of the Year by the Daily Maverick. In 2022, the Women in Economic Development Leadership Forum awarded her a certificate of acknowledgement to acknowledge the years of dedication to the field of business leadership and economic development in South Africa. And she writes widely in the press. And 2 weeks ago, I sat in a presentation by a very prominent economist, and it was notable to highlight that he put up her photograph and said, this is a person that we need to listen to every single day. Ms. Mavuso, you have the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Skay. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I guess you would understand why I probably am very intimidated, but that introduction is good to intimidate anyone. But I'm very pleased to be here with you this evening, and thank you very much for the invitation, Archbishop. This is an absolute honor. Thank you very much. And I think maybe let me properly start by paying my respects to His Grace, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, in whose honor we're gathered here today, as well as Mrs. Lungelwa Makgoba. Ndiyabulela, ma'am. Professor Sizwe Mabizela, the Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University, Professor Owen Skye, Director of Rhodes Business School, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Peter Clayton, as well as the members of the cloth who are here tonight. Thank you very much. All protocols observed, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And thank you very much for providing me the honor to come and have this conversation with you this evening, where we seek to define, understand, and dissect this notion of values-based leadership and why it matters. Or at least that is how I would actually want to pivot my conversation here tonight. A very interesting topic indeed, especially in the context of where we find ourselves as a country at the moment. You know, in preparing for this lecture, I decided to look up. I didn't want to go with my own definition of what values-based leadership is. So I thought, let me just look up what Richard Barrett in particular, who's one of the authorities on values-based leadership, says about this phenomenon or this notion. And I think definition that most resonated with me from him is one where he says, values-based leadership asserts that people are mostly motivated by values. And they live according to these beliefs, which means that values are our most natural motivators. He says, therefore, in making decisions, it is natural that leaders refer to their own values. And I thought that was interesting. In making decisions, it is natural that leaders will refer to their own values. And I had to pause and think about that. And I think I was trying to understand that, by the way, as South African leaders, both political and business, what is our value system? Is there a clearly defined set of values that guides us as leaders? Having been in business, at least for the past 27 years, and yes, I know I look 27, but yeah, having been in business for the past 27 years and having engaged with government, having often found myself sitting across the table from ministers, from the president, from labor union leaders, from civil society leaders, can I really come up with a clear, succinct, maybe set of values of what really guides us as leaders in South Africa today? You know, one of the most valuable lessons most of us were taught when we were growing up was that integrity is the best quality to possess by any human being. And I grew up in a community with limited resources, but in spite or despite of our poor backgrounds, thieves were shunned. Hard work and honest living were valued. That is the era in which I grew up. But I look at where we are today, and I look at what has happened over the years, and we have sadly watched the degradation of our society, where corruption and theft have been normalized. The moral code in our society today is on the decline. Education in the home, education in communities, education in the school do not convey a positive value system. Lawlessness is the order of the day. We have fallen from being a rainbow nation into being a mafia state. That is where South Africa is today. And to fix this, we need leadership. But which leadership, I ask myself? Because our biggest problem as a country today is that this fish called South Africa is rotting from the head. So if we agree that leadership is what we need to fix the state of affairs as a country, which leadership is this? Because those that sit at the top are unfortunately not good examples. Values-based leadership and why it matters. You know, I was watching the December 2022 ANC election race over the weekend, or was it 2 weeks ago? And I see that it's now a 3-horse race between NDZ, CR, and the former disgraced health minister, Dr. Zweli Mkhize. And I see in the top 6 that the KZN is putting together, they've brought in Nomvule Mokonyane. What a shame. That is a slap across the face of South Africans. And I look at it and I say, how did we get here as a country? Since when is a culture of corruption acceptable? Since when is a culture conducive to theft acceptable? Since when is being accused of crime not embarrassing? Since when has having elected officials who see nothing wrong from stealing food parcels from the hungry and PPE from the sick and dying not a shame? Since when has having thieves masquerading as government ministers, as government officials been acceptable? When did we get here as a country? And at what point did our bar drop so low? South Africa. And if that is the culture at the top, I look at it and I say, if we are worried about the fact that we are being ruled by lawlessness as a country, what are we expecting? Because clearly the messages that are actually coming from the top are saying that even when you commit crime, nothing will happen to you. The message from the top says that crime pays. The message from the top says that even when you are a thief, you can still hold a high political office. The message from the top says that Even when you have been found stealing, you can even be the president of the country. That is the message that we are sending from. And we're sitting here and we're talking about the levels of crime in our country. What are you expecting? Of course, crime will be as rampant as it actually is. And who do you think is going to get a handle on that crime? Because it can't be the leadership that we have. Where do they even begin? They don't have the right to stand on any podium and talk about the levels of crime or how we actually deal with it. Because they too are not innocent. You know, countries fall apart when governance fails at that level. And that is why, for me, government matters. You know, we're sitting in an environment today where the same way that the National Party was associated with racism in the past, we're sitting in an environment where this ANC-led government is today synonymous with corruption. The biggest weakness in South Africa today is that the politics no longer work. The biggest weakness in South Africa today is that the governing party's interests are no longer congruent with the nation's interest. And that is a fact. You know, a month ago, I participated in a conference, a News 24 conference at the Sandton Convention Center. And I was on a panel that was trying to answer the question of how do we make South Africa investable? Or why are we finding it difficult to attract investment as a country? But before we came on as a panel, we had Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who came to give the keynote address. And he said something quite concerning in his keynote address. He said, Parliament could have stopped the state capture project, but they did not. They did not because the ANC protected it by pushing back against the motions of establishing inquiries of establishing inquiries into the influence of the Guptas. And they pushed back against the motions of no confidence that were put across on Jacob Zuma. He says the evidence that was given by CR and the national chairperson of the ANC at the State Capture Commission was that the ANC MPs cannot vote against their own party president in parliament, even if they know that he is in the wrong. He says, so if we were to have a state capture 2.0 as a country, he said, I am not convinced that this ANC-led government will be able to stop it. And I agree with him. Because those people, the elected officials that we have pinned our hopes on as a country, I don't know at what point who can vow that even when you are wrong as the president, we are going to protect you. We are not going to call you out. We will protect you against the 62 million South Africans who depend on you to give them a better life for all. I don't know at what point that vow was taken, but he says, if we had to have a state capture 2.0, I'm not convinced that we will be able to stop it. I'm talking about values-based leadership and why it matters. And earlier on, I asked the question as to whether do we have a clear value system that guides us as leaders in this country. You know, government particularly matters to me, and I'll come to the private sector just now. Government in particular matters for me because it is governments that set countries apart. It is governments that set countries apart. It is not geography. It is not natural endowments. It is not strongman leadership. It is governments. Governments are what separates bad, failing states from good, prosperous states. So governments matter. But we sit in an environment as South Africa where we are because our leaders are not what they ought to be. We have the quality of political leadership with a propensity of serving narrow and short-sighted interests. And that's our biggest hindrance as a country. And as a result, we have severely weakened our business case for investment, along with our position as a gateway to the African continent as a country. Our focus right now in terms of where we are needs to be on economic recovery. It needs to be trying to attract investment. Why? Because we are currently sitting in a country where more than 50% of our people are living in poverty. Investment matters because it is only through sustainable economic growth that we get ourselves out of this economic rut. It is only through sustainable economic growth that we change our social structure, our pyramid social structure, where you have 10% of the population that is living in opulence, about 30%, which is the middle class, and more than 50% of our citizens living in poverty. And I don't even know if that is the social structure anymore, because when you speak to some people, they will tell you that, no, we're sitting in an environment where the social structure is 20-80. 80% of people living in poverty and 20% opulent. And if that is the case, oh my goodness, we are in trouble. We are in trouble because we know that countries that prosper are those that have got a diamond social structure, where you've got 80% of the citizens sitting in the middle class. The middle class matters because it is the middle class that carries economies, not the rich. So sustainable economic growth, it matters how we position ourselves as a country, and it matters which foot we put forward as a country. When we stand as South Africa, what do we want the world to see? Because whether we like it or not, whether we accept it or not, whether we realize it or not, South Africa cannot get itself out of this economic rut. We need international foreign investment to pull ourselves. Even if we can give people 350 unemployment grants, that's fine, but that is a means to an end. It cannot be an end in itself. Even when government speaks about the basic income grant of 600 or 1,000 rand or whatever the case, it is neither here nor there. Social grants have never lifted people out of poverty. If you're sitting in a country of 43% unemployment, in terms of the expanded definition, where you have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape, social grants are not going to cut it. If you're sitting in a country where more than 60% of our young people are unemployed, most of them with degrees, they are not looking for 350 unemployment grants. They are looking to be active economic citizens. How do we facilitate that as a country? We can only facilitate it by sustainable economic. You see, what we are trying to do as a country, and this is my frustration normally when we have these conversations with government, which in my mind, I don't think they get. What we have to try and, you see, when you look at this room and you are trying to create space. It doesn't matter how much you shift these chairs around to create space. It is not going to help. What we need as a country is not shifting deck chairs around. It is creating the size of this room to be bigger. So how do we grow the pie? You grow the pie by growing the economy. Our economic growth has barely touched 1% in real terms since 2013. And our population is growing at about 1.6%. It is a recipe for disaster. Without investment, we are not going to be able to arrest this thing. So what's happening in the country, or what is not happening in the country, matters. Because when the international community looks at us, when we try and position ourselves for investment, they look at us and they say, but do we want to put our money in South Africa? Because remember, we're not the only ones who are actually trying to get investment, especially after COVID. And when you look at the international community, has their eyes and their sight set on Africa as a continent. But which country will win in Africa is the one that is best able to position itself as an investment destination. And South Africa at the moment is not doing a good job of it. I don't know how many of you are aware that we are about to be grey listed as a country. Now, we thought being a sub-investment grade or a junk status country was bad. Wait until we are grey listed. And that is simply because of the own goals that we have scored as a country. It is because people that were involved in the state capture project are still walking around with impunity. It is because we have not taken to jail anyone that was actually involved in the state capture project. It is through those useless things. The international community is looking at us and they are saying that even with money laundering, we are worried that as South Africa, you are now a conduit. You don't have a control environment strong enough to be able to detect and deal with these illicit money flows. So whatever money laundering transactions that have to happen, go through South Africa because we are the weakest link. As a result, FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, is about to grey list South Africa. So how do we really get ourselves out of this economic rut? You know, there is a lot that is not going right in South Africa today. And it will be disingenuous of me to place all of this at the door of government. And yes, government has done a lot, but it will be disingenuous of me to place all of this at the door of government. Because you then have to look and say, it is only business, the same business that I lead. It is only business in this country that is the only social partner with disproportionate resources. But how is business using its disproportionality to effect the change that we'd like to see in this country? Because business, whether we like it or not, as the grouping that has levers to economic power, has a special responsibility to drive this agenda. Business has a special responsibility to drive the socio-economic transformation agenda, because with high such levels of domestic inequality, we will not be able to achieve social stability as a country. And I think we saw a taste of what social destabilization looks like in July 2021 as a country. And I think we all agree that we don't want to go back there again. So business has a special responsibility to deal with these issues because we are currently sitting in an environment where you've got two economies, one nation. Business has a special responsibility because no nation in the world can achieve inclusive socio-economic growth by excluding the majority of the citizens of this country. Business has a special responsibility because as a country, whether we like it or not, we cannot go to war with only 10% of our soldiers. Business has a special responsibility because the biggest ticking time bomb that we have in this country is inequality. Business has a special responsibility because our situation right now is unsustainable. Business has a responsibility because we realized in 2021 and during COVID that the economic vulnerability of certain segments of our society affects the vulnerability or increases the vulnerability for all of us. And more importantly, business has a responsibility because what we achieved in 1994 as a country was democracy. And democracy is a political system. It is not justice, neither is it equality. So from that perspective, business has a role to play. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm trying to dissect this issue of values-based leadership, and I'm trying to look at why it matters. And I've asked a question earlier on to say, is there a clear value system that guides us as leaders? Because you see, if there was a clear value system that guides us as leaders, if there was a clear value system that guides us as business in particular, we would not be paying women 30% of what we pay men in a country where 52% of the population is women, and where more than 40% of the cities, or rather of the households, are led by women. If there was a clear value system that guided us, the stats would not be saying that the 58% of the income that accrues in this country goes to only 10% of the population. And only 10% of the income goes to more than 50% of the population. And I think the 30-odd% is somewhere in the middle class. We have overtaken Brazil as the most unequal society in the world. Our Gini coefficient when we took this country over in 1994 was about 0.57. We are sitting with the Gini coefficient now of about 0.69. We are moving more and more towards inequality or being an unequal society as a country. And we have to ask the question of who is this democracy serving? And what is business's role in effecting the change that we actually want to see? You see, I was appalled in, please don't quote me on this date, I think it must be 2017 if I'm not mistaken, when we started having the discussions as a country, as the different social partners, of effecting a national minimum wage. And I remember at the time, we were talking about 20 rands per hour. And that 20 rands per hour equated to 3,500 per month. It was business who pushed back against paying people 3,500 rands per month. And I was appalled because when I looked at the stats, I learned that we were adamant on effecting a national minimum wage because 43% of people were going to benefit from it. 43% of people who woke up every day saying that I'm going to work did not earn 3,500. They earned less than 3,500. And it was business who pushed back against paying 3,500, saying that it's going to affect our profits. Really? So business, in a lot of ways, is just as guilty as government is in terms of where we find ourselves at the moment. You see, and I normally have this conversation with my colleagues and I say to them, if we look at where we are as a country and we ask ourselves a question as business in terms of why is this a problem? Well, the answer is simple. It is our problem because ours is an incomplete transition as a country. And I think a lot has been said around the incomplete transition that we actually continue to be on as a country. You see, some of these injustices that we have as a country are bad for business. They are bad for economics. They don't make moral sense. And they need to be dealt with. And they certainly do not espouse the values-based leadership that we're talking about today. You know, you just need to look at the youth unemployment. And I've already spoken to the fact that it is sitting at about 60% plus. And that alone tells you that we are a country in trouble. That alone tells you that we are a nation in trouble. We're sitting with young people who are disillusioned in South Africa today. And this is a serious indictment on us as leaders. And I'm not just talking about government. It is a serious indictment on government and business leaders alike. And it points to a failure in leadership. You know, growing up as a young girl, raised by a widowed mom who was widowed when I was only 8 years old, and there was 4 of us that she had to raise, she often preached that, you know, when I pass on one day, I will have nothing to leave you. So the best that you can do for yourselves is to get an education. Put all your efforts in your studies so that you can be guaranteed a bright future. And she was right. But where I sit today, I cannot tell my kids the same thing. Because education, the same education that has lifted many of us and our families out of poverty, the same education that has lifted us from one social class to the other, the same education that is a tool for effective, or that is a tool more effective for development, has been rendered useless today. And I'm saying that because you're sitting with kids who are unemployed with degrees at home. So can I still tell those kids that go to school, get an education so that you can have a bright future? I think let's accept that that no longer holds true in South Africa today. You know, one of the biggest gripes and one of the things that maybe it's fine, we can get everything else wrong as a country, but I think one of the things that we have to at least get right is education. You see, South Africa is an open economy. South Africa has chosen to play on the global stages, which means that we are not only competing with ourselves, but we are competing with the rest of the world. So if we subject these kids to this subpar and substandard education at a basic level, if the early childhood development is not what it should be, because we know, that those first few years of life are important for formation. So if we subject them to poor quality education at that level, do we realize that our kids have lost the race before they've even begun running? If you're going to sit in an environment where your grade 4 learners cannot read for meaning, when you are competing with the Asian tigers, whose grade 4 learners are already being taught programming and coding, can you see that we are condemning our kids to a life where they'll be dependent on social grants, just like their parents? So how do we then pull ourselves out of this economic rut when we are even failing at the basics? So it's fine. Maybe we can steal money and be corrupt and mess up ESCOM and Transnet and whatever the case is. But what are we saying about where South Africa ought to be tomorrow? Where are our leaders going to come from? If these kids, they might just as well give up. They've lost the race before they've even begun. They do not stand a chance. Not in the world that we operate in today. The education that we are subjecting them to is not going to make them competitive. And we're sitting in an environment where you've got labor pushing back, and I understand why they are pushing back when we import skills. But the reason why South African companies are importing skills is because they need to be internationally competitive. You know, when I speak to the CEO of BMW South Africa, he says, you know, Busi, my biggest competitor is not Mercedes-Benz South Africa. My biggest competitor is BMW China, BMW Brazil, BMW US, BMW UK. Because when I sit in Germany and we talk about investment allocation, I normally have to produce a solid business case for investment in Germany. And he says, if I fail to do that, then investment is allocated to BMW China, to BMW US, to BMW UK. They give nothing to South Africa. And we're sitting here, our president has told us that our main true north needs to be to try and get 1.2 trillion rands of investment. With what business case? When we don't even have the labor market that can deem BMW South Africa competitive. What is BMW South Africa supposed to go to war with when it's faced with BMW China? Because the quality of our labor is not what it should be. I normally look at it as I close. I look at this and I say, you know, as leaders, history is going to judge us very harshly. Our kids, the young people sitting in the room today, are going to judge us very harshly. They are going to say, you were there when these things happened. What was your contribution? What did you do? I don't know as a business leader today how I justify. Colleagues, I'm still talking about values-based leadership and why it matters. I don't know how as a business leader today I can justify that I sit in an office in Sandton, which is the richest square mile in Africa, right under the nose of Alexander, where people are subjected to the most abject poverty. I don't know how I justify as a business leader today that maybe, just maybe, these kids might have to go and look for a future somewhere else. Because it doesn't matter how gifted they are going to be limited by the environments that they come from. I don't know how I justify as a leader today that even the most gifted of these kids are not going to be able to escape the limitations of their environment. I don't know how I justify to these kids today that maybe they might have a brighter future in a different country. I don't know how we justify that input doesn't equal output in this country. It's more a function of which side of the fence you were born. If you are born in Alexander, your future is predetermined. And if you're born in Sandton, your future is predetermined. I don't know I don't know how we look these kids in the eye today and justify how the Black young students sitting in the room, I don't know how I justify to you guys that Black youth unemployment is sitting at about 80% when white youth unemployment is sitting at 1%. And yet I stand here and I'm the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, an institution which leads the JSE listed companies, multinationals, and big businesses in this country. I don't know how I even begin to justify what conversations I'm having with my CEOs in terms of how we effect the transformation that is required. But I think one thing is clear, that, you know, some things are bigger than self-interest, and those are the issues of national interest. So I think at some point, business is going to have to be motivated by more than just the profit motive. Because you see, if you're operating in a country where there is so much domestic inequality, we are fools as business if we think that we'll have social stability. We are never going to have a conducive environment within which to operate. And I think it is about time, and we are having these conversations with business, but it's still coming slow. You know, the stats are still telling us, you know, that in the C-suites of corporate South Africa today, 70% of the leadership is white males. In a country where the stats tell us that there is more Black African women coming into universities, there is more fast graduating, and there is more fast being absorbed into corporate South Africa. I don't know how I justify that there continues to be an artificial glass ceiling for people who look like me in corporate South Africa. And yet I stand here calling myself the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. So business is going to have to soon to realize that, you see, some of these things cannot just be left to government. They are businesses' responsibility as much as they are government's responsibility. We have to make sure that this ANC-led government, at least at the moment, succeeds. So as Professor Skay, when it says, when I pen the articles, the 3 articles that I pen on a weekly basis, it is my attempt at forcing this government kicking and screaming to say that even when I irritate you, even when you chase me out of parliament, I'm still going to be on the right side of the truth. It is my attempt at saying you have to succeed. You have to succeed, because if you don't succeed as government, then it means South Africa fails. And if South Africa fails, then business fails. So we don't have a choice. We are joined at the hip with government. So they have, our success is dependent on their success. And I think that show me a failed state and I'll show you a failed nation. So if this government fails, we fail as a nation. And if this nation fails, it means that business would have failed as well. So I've said when I draw to a close, but I really mean it this time, Professor Skay, as I draw to a close. So, you know, when a nation fails, when a country fails, when a company fails, you need to look no further than the quality of their leadership. And unfortunately, the political culture and business culture we have in South Africa today, whether good or bad, is a product of the values and behaviors of us as leaders. That is where the culture comes from. And it follows that the best way to create a positive culture is to stop unethical people from rising to the top. Remember, values-based leadership is a philosophy that asserts that people are mostly motivated by values and they live according to these beliefs, which means that the values are our most natural motivators. And in making decisions, leaders will normally refer to their own values. And remember, input versus equals output. So it means garbage in is garbage out. So if you put leaders who are not even supposed to be called leaders in the first place, we cannot sit here and ask ourselves the question of why are we here as a country? It's because we have put these people here. So we need to actually be held accountable. So colleagues, in my view, values-based leadership is how we change our economic trajectory. Values-based leadership is how we actually give people a stake in the economy. Values-based leadership is how we actually choose our leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
So I promise you, I wasn't looking for. But I think the transparency with which you reflected on being able to justify very tough things. As we go, our open questions, Mavuso says, there are the same parts, so you won't which is not comfortable asking the question, will say no and move on. So over to you. All right. Yes, Mr. Maleka. Thanks so much for coming. You know, I reflect on the time and I look at that this similar last time and a reference to America came up and came up and it was quite interesting because I was actually today and some serious times of the thing that I was thinking that meant that James basically pushing me and so I reflected on it. I think maybe there's time for us now to go back to that. You know, you have to design it. Yes, you know, government are part of their own money. And this is the issue. That's what I find. Take big place. And you can speak out in fact. Okay, I'm going to briefly give the three questions back for those that are in the virtual medium who can't hear the questions. Apologies for that. So the first question relates to the Sullivan Code, something that was started in the days of apartheid by Reverend Sullivan, and whether the time had come for business in South Africa to adopt something similar. Fair. Second question was related to the fact that Ms. Mavuso about the lack of foreign direct investment, but President Mbeki reminded us that African companies are saving a lot of money already that they're not investing in the country. And what were they doing about that? And then in relation to the labor market and the haves and the have-nots, we have unequal competitiveness in South Africa, and what is business doing about that? And then the last question was whether the focus was on values or whether it's a lack of wisdom, and the fact that we can't see further than our shoes, that once upon a time there were many, many jobs that were being advertised, but Nowadays, there are a lot of imports that come into South Africa. And the question is like chicken and so on. What is it that business is doing about that? So those are the three questions. It's Mavuso.
Thank you for those questions. So, you know, if you look at our Employment Equity Act, and I think to a certain degree, the BBB Act, I think what we try to do and the affirmative action policy that we have as a country, what we try to do, or its principles were based on the Sullivan Codes. And I think you'd remember that it was the Black Management Forum under Lord Ndlovu back in the day. And I think our Professor Wiseman Nkuhlu, you know, who actually put that together. And if you look at the original version that came from the BMF at the time, you will see that the Employment Equity Act that we have, or that we put in place in 1998 as a country, was a very watered down version of what was submitted by the Black Management Forum. So the Black Management Forum, in putting this thing together, was very clear, you know, because as to your point, the principles that were actually espoused in this thing came directly from the Sullivan principles. They had put targets, they had put timelines, they had put, yeah, you know, when you talk about SMART objectives, you know, when are you going to achieve this thing? Specificity, you know, are we going to be able to measure it and whatever the case is? And it went into, if I'm not mistaken, was it President Cyril Ramaphosa, I think at that time, who actually led, or was in BBBE. But what came back from NEDLEC, you know, we put these things together and we take them to NEDLEC and they become very much watered down. And now we're sitting with this Employment Equity Act that is actually toothless. But when you look at our Employment Equity Act, you will see that it is not actually toothless. It does, I think, with all its imperfections, you know, I'm very careful when I talk about the Employment Equity Act and the affirmative action in particular, because a lot of us are actually a product of the same affirmative action and Employment Equity Act. But when you look at it, you will see that it's all its imperfections. It has really tried to usher in the much required transformation in corporate South Africa. But where this thing has failed is when we stopped at monitoring and evaluation. If I'm not mistaken, I think the Act says that if you are not going to meet these EE targets, there's going to be penalties that are actually going to be levied to these companies. But ask me how many companies have actually been charged these penalties, you know? So I think if you are going to put a tool, if you're going to put an instrument, if you're going to put a code or an intervention to try and correct a situation, you had better follow it through. If you're not going to follow it through, then don't even bother putting it. And I think 28 years into democracy, we're sitting in an environment where business has actually caught on to say that whether you meet these employment equity targets or not, you know, whether you meet this BBB code, actually they engage with these pieces of legislation from a compliance perspective. It's a tick box exercise, you know, and look at the foolishness, you know, from business, from that perspective. We do not realize that what these acts are actually trying to do is normalize our society, because ours is an abnormal society. You know, if we were to follow these acts and implement them to the letter, the diamond structure that I'm talking about, that is what these acts are meant to achieve. Because the issue of transformation is a very puzzling one for me, because business should understand that in effecting transformation, it is actually self-serving for them, because in effecting transformation, you get to have more people with disposable income. And you have more people with disposable income means that these are the people that can come into your businesses to buy your goods and services. It means that from a GDP perspective, you can impact the consumer spending. You know, and if households don't have disposable income to spend, it means that you're going to sit in this environment where, you know, you don't have enough economic activity to enable you to keep your doors open. It means that the bottom line and the profits that you actually have to post are not going to be what they are. So only if we realize that, right? But even if business doesn't realize it. So I think that's the one thing. So I don't know if we can sit here and expect Turkey to be excited about Christmas. We can't sit 28 years into democracy. I don't think that transformation should be left, you know, to business to do the right thing. You know, policies exist for a policy is the only instrument that governments around the world have to actually affect and shape the economy the way they want to. So they should actually be using policy to drag business kicking and screaming to do the right thing. Business should not be given a choice. It is not up to them. You know, but it becomes a problem if you have to probably maybe sit and say, have we defined what type of society we want to have in the next, I don't know, 50 years? You know, it becomes a problem if you have a government that thinks that they can lead a country with only 5 years of thought. Look at, we're sitting in this stop-start situation. You know, government comes in 5 years, they do just enough to secure them the next elections. You know, and the new minister comes in, rubbishes everything that the other one has done. And, you know, at what point do we get to a point where you have a 50-year strategy? You know, like China, the Belt and Roads Initiative, it doesn't matter which government or which president comes into power, the strategy is clear. It's the Belt and Roads Initiative. And that Belt and Roads Initiative is looking at conquering Africa. And they are conquering Africa. You see, so I think it starts there. You know, what is the vision? What type of society do we want to? Do we agree, first of all, that ours needs to be a diamond society where we've got a bulging middle class? If we're trying to get 80% of the population to sit in the middle class, what policies and what interventions are going to get us there? So I think we are failing from a planning perspective. And I think that is what the problem is. Okay, someone was saying something, maybe I'm going too long, but I think you get where I'm saying it is not up to business. Business shouldn't have a choice in this issue. You know, we are trying to normalize our society and policies are our instrument to try and normalize our society. Mzobans, I agree with you. Domestic investment is a problem. You know, so the international community looks at it and says, what is business in South Africa doing? But maybe let me ask you this question. What is the local ownership at the JSE? Because you see, the JSE is 65% foreign owned, Mzobans, which means that when you're talking about domestic investment, you're talking about these various, you're talking about BMW South Africa, who has to go with a begging bowl to Germany, you know, to say that, will you allocate investment? And Germany looks at it. You see, these countries don't understand our politics. I sit, Mzobanzi, with ambassadors from all over the world. I sat with the Nordic ambassadors, I think about a month ago, if not 3 weeks ago, whatever the case is. I think I had Denmark, I had Finland, and I had Norway. None of them are more than 3 months in the country. And when they normally engage with me as BLSA, they are trying to understand the lay of the land. They are trying to understand what is, and they don't just talk to business, they talk to everyone. You know, I'm sure they talk to labor, they talk to government, they talk to investors, say, in whatever the case is. They are just trying to look at South Africa through our lens. What is the status quo? What is happening? What are the interventions that are likely going to come in the next 3 months? Where are you with structural reforms? Are you going to sort out the issue of network industries? Are you ever going to achieve energy security in this country? Are the ports going to be functional at some point? You know, are we going to get to a point where you don't have these trucks, you know, that are actually a problem on the road and you're actually going to go back to the railway? Is the water infrastructure that is going to be the next crisis, the same way that ESCOM is a crisis? Are you having a handle of that? You know, are you, right? They want to know all these, and they are asking those questions because they want to determine how much they should be investing in South Africa. Remember, South Africa is an insignificant player in the broader scheme of things. The interest in South Africa is insofar as we are a gateway to the African continent. The international community is interested in the 1.3 billion people that are sitting in the continent. We're only 62 million people. I mean, if they were interested in if they were looking at countries, South Africa wouldn't even have a chance, because you've got a Nigeria, which has got 150 million people. So we are a gateway to the African continent. They come through South Africa to be able to access the African continent. So if South Africa is not going to make it easy for investment to land here, they go elsewhere, Mzobanzi. We've got, and you see, the advantage that we've always had as a country is that from an infrastructure perspective, we look like them. So we're the most advanced economy in the continent. So the infrastructure that if you have traveled anywhere else in the world, you will see, that honestly, we are squandering a very good opportunity, as a country, because I'm sure you can walk in some of these suburbs here in South Africa, and you can find yourself in Washington, DC in the US, and you will be like, this could be a suburb in South Africa. That's where we are from an infrastructure perspective. So foreign investors therefore find it easy to land in South Africa because they don't have to change their lifestyles that much, because then we've got the because go to other African countries, you will see the infrastructure, just as you land in their airports, you see that, gunzimap, so it becomes important, therefore, Mzobanzi, that when we talk about domestic investment, who are we talking about? When the JSE is 65% foreign owned, because these very same companies that were saying are South African companies, in essence, they are not, because they don't make investment decisions here. BMW Germany has got 100 rands, using a figure, 100 rands of investment that they are actually that is the pot that they've allocated for 2022. And they operate in a whole lot of markets in the world. And they actually have to slice this 100 rand to say 5 rand is going there, 10 rand is going there, 20 rand is going there. And how they determine how much goes to which country is to the extent that you can bring a solid business case. So if Peter, the CEO of BMW South Africa, goes there and talks about labor demanding 7% increases when the economic growth has not touched 1% in real terms since 2013. When he talks about the fact that their plant was decimated because of the July 2021 riots. When he talks about the fact that we sit in a country with more than 8 hours of load shedding per day. When he talks about the fact that as companies, they have to actually make means around providing their own water infrastructure. Right, already that it becomes difficult. So I think that is the issue. So it was not an investment strike. I think it's capital is like water. It will always follow the path of least resistance. So if South Africa is going to make it difficult for capital to land here, capital goes elsewhere. So whether we define that as an investment strike or not, it is capital doing what capital will do all over the world. So South Africa is not a special case. And I think we've got a problem of thinking that we are a special case. Tatu Tondolo, you are right. You see, you're asking a question of whether is it a lack of wisdom? And should leaders not have wisdom? We probably maybe have to go 2 steps back, Tatu Tondolo, and say, what is leadership? Who do you define as a leader? What makes a leader a leader? And if you answer that question, you therefore have to say, do these people that we call leaders here in South Africa, do they fall into that category? Should we even be calling them leaders? Because from where I'm sitting, there are a whole lot of people in this country that I wouldn't say their name and leadership in one sentence, because they are not. You see, leadership, where I come from, is about three things and three things only. Leadership is about integrity. Leadership is about courage. And leadership is about being decisive. So I don't know how many people that we actually have in this country that we're calling leaders fit that criteria. So when you're talking about lack of wisdom, and maybe you probably have to go back and say, how do we choose our leaders, by the way? You know, when KZN comes up with Zwelim Keys and Nomvula Mukonyane, and Jacob Zuma has put his hand up again and there's people backing him, how do we come up with leaders in this country? Do we see nothing wrong with putting people who are convicted rapists, and he has just made his case go away just now, and you call that a leader? Really? So I don't think that we can even question, you know, what leadership should be or what it shouldn't be, wisdom or whatever the case. They were never leaders in the first place. So that is the problem that we actually have as a country. And you are right, there is a lot of short-sightedness. You see, the issue of, and I was talking about policy earlier on, I've asked the question many times when we sit with Patel across the table around protectionist interventions. We're currently having a discussion at NETLEC around localization. And the question I always ask is that we are not against localization as business. Localization makes sense. Localization means we are going to arrest this 43% unemployment in terms of the expanded definition. But before you want to drive localization at all costs, what protectionist interventions are you putting in place? Because if you are going to say local content and you allow them to compete with these China substitute products, you know, and these, and you still allow dumping practices, you know, you're talking about the issue of how are local producers supposed to compete with that? You know, at what point do we actually say they are, you know, as foolish and as stupid as Donald Trump was, but I admired him for one thing and one thing and only. You know, he said, USA first, America first. So America first in terms of businesses, America first in terms of people, America. I don't think we've got something like that in South Africa. At what point do we say South Africa first? At what point do we say we are going to disallow some of these dumped products in South Africa because we are trying to protect our local market, we're trying to protect our local businesses, we're trying to protect our local people. So I think it's a function of policy, you know, because you can't have both, you know, because you're setting up our local producers against what they are not going to be in a position. And now to allow these China imports. So as a business, I can buy this pen, which has been dumped from China for 10 rands. And you still allow a local producer, and because they have to pay certain salaries, they have to do this, there's the triple P compliance, there's ESCOM, they need to put generators, there's, you know, all of that. It means that the cost of producing this pen for them is not even going to be that 10 rands that I buy it with from China. It's probably going to be 40 rands. So if they charge me 50 rand for that, as a business, I'm obviously not, you know, the economic climate is very tough. So where you can save, you will save. So I'm not going to buy this thing because I'm proudly South African for 50 rands when I can get it for 10 rand. So what therefore is the role of government and the role of policy in disallowing these pens to be dumped from China for 10 rands in an effort to protect local businesses? So I think when it comes to the issues that you're raising, I really think that we really have to look at what protection intervention do we need to put in place to ensure that we can go back to industrialization, you know, as a country, because we need it. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you. Now when you talk about the greater ambassadors of gender, I mean, I spent years learning about the different parts of the book that are not using it. That's what the kids are being. You talk about the majority of the population are being poor and not having better. Similar to what I experienced in the sense that we have the same problem. And what I discovered, the majority of the poor come from the same people who experience that. So now I'm asking myself, if I look at that, to what problem? How do I look? So in our case here now, we can claim that yes, that and how we could say that either. So these are the things because they are given handouts, they are given a friend material, and they are excited during the same time. So how do we then change that if they got to think?
Now, I'll give the questions for the virtual office.
All right, thank you very much. So, in terms of value-based, I always wonder, like, we always start with the, like, government, corporate, and it's something that really bothers me. It bothers me because, I'm a big soccer fan. I'll just give you some time ago, I was watching this Super Bowl, and they were talking about how Spain managed to win the 2010 World Cup, and how their planning started in 1998, where Spain played against Nigeria, and the Nigerian players were too physical. So every time they beat them on the ball, and that's how they were losing against their good thing. So they had a horrible World Cup, and then they decided to say, actually, let's change how we play. And they started from young, from those who are 5 years old, every single person from that young age has to learn how to play like that. So by the time they get to the senior team, they expect like everyone plays the similar kind of system. They don't have the weight, they don't have the strength of, let's say, the physically the suffocating. So what is the best plan to keep the ball? If you keep the ball, pass the ball quickly so that nobody goes. That got me thinking. I was like, look at the planning for this. The planning from a young age to us. I'm bringing this point forward. When a lot of the time when we speak about that, we're speaking about that things and problem. And sometimes, a lot of the time, we are leaving the high school, the primary school. I mean, this might sound controversial, but we put religion out of okay, but we didn't stick with anything else. I don't think we have a common conscious thing like the nation. I mean, how do we expect someone who from a high school didn't act the second way, when they get to university, all of a sudden you want them to act properly? When in university you act, you believe that protesting and banning property is a legitimate way of voicing your concern. You get to the working world, all of a sudden you're going to change that. And I think that is a thing I think we need to really think about, because giving a simple Bible is even very clear those who are religious. You read what you saw. You cannot expect something to a different scenario. Yeah, I just wanted to say that. Thank you very much.
So, and
So I think I'm just going to pose two of your sub-questions there. Right? So the first question from Maxwell was the conundrum about why it is that people continue, I'm repeating the question, continue to re-elect people who don't serve their interests. Secondly, in relation to Eric's question around the soccer analogy, but the question there was, we always seem to target corporates and government. What are we doing about young people, about growing what needs to happen? So the values are there. And then lastly, from Kaliso, is there room for disagreement? And how do we work out ways to disagree, still find a solution? And is there any hope for us in the midst of what you've had to say tonight?
Maxwell, I think I absolutely agree with you. You know, and I think the only thing I will say to the comment that you have just made is that the extent of oppression or the length of oppression, how long you remain oppressed, the length of that extension is always determined by the oppressed, not the oppressor. And I think we don't seem to get that in particular as South Africans. And maybe as Africans broadly, right? As you're saying that we actually, you know, the biggest disappointment for me as South Africa is that we achieved our liberation last in the continent. And I would have thought that having come last, you make sure that you don't repeat the mistakes that have been done by those who actually came before you. We are repeating the very same mistakes, and I think we are even doing them worse. That is the biggest disappointment for me, you know, West South Africa. But you are right, the extent of oppression can only be determined by the oppressed. So only when people are saying enough is enough, this thing will stop. So until people continue to tolerate the mediocrity, the incompetence, the thieving, it is going to continue because I think that they are tolerating it. So I think it is up to us. You are absolutely right. So you know, when I listen to you talk about soccer, I once read a book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Outlier. He says, success is not a random act. Success arises out of a predictable and powerful set of circumstances. You set people up for success. You don't wake up and say, you know, it is very deliberate. It is very, you know, when you look at these, whether it's, who's the guy at golf and Serena Williams, the tennis and whatever, their parents were very deliberate about setting them up for, and the book Outlier is all about this. Success arises out of a predictable set of circumstances. It is not a random act. So I think to your point, until we are, you see, this thing is broken. And I'm probably, I think, picking on government and on business, government in particular, because I look at it and I say, state capital ought to know better. State capital has a bigger responsibility because you're dealing with people's lives. You're dealing with people's tax monies. You have taken an oath of office. So you have no business whatsoever being there if you don't understand that servant leadership is not a leader with many servants, but it's about ensuring that you serve You know, those that, and only in Africa do leaders don't get the notion of servant leadership. Only in Africa do leaders think that, you know, they exist for us to continue calling them honorable, honorable. And I look at it and I say, there is absolutely nothing honorable about you. So it's a problem, but the social fabric has fundamentally broken, because these people, before they get to be government ministers and CEOs and executives, they are someone's daughter, they are someone's husband, they are someone's son, they are someone's. So what conversations are we having in our households? Because this is where we are. I can't think that I'm not going to do what I'm supposed to do as a parent at home and think that my son and daughter will somehow be caught by the system out there. I expect lecturers, professors, teachers, whatever, to teach them. So what values are we actually, right, giving our kids at home? But also it talks to, and I think I raised the question earlier on, how do we choose our leaders? You know, because to your point, you know, these people that they were never, their values are not what they should be. And yet these are people whom you elect in SRCs. These are people whom you elect in this branch. I don't know how the ANC elect their people. You know, these are the people you see. So, but what does it say about you who are electing these people? Because leaders are made by their followers. No leader puts themselves in position. It's followers who actually put themselves there. You know, so before you look at a leader and say they are corrupt, what about the followers? So the followers' value systems should actually be questioned as well, because they've got no business whatsoever. Just because I've got the biggest voice and I talk a whole lot of rubbish, it doesn't mean I'm talking sense. And I don't think that people should elect me, you know, because I've got the loudest mouths, you know, because a lot of these leaders, that's all they've got going for them. You know, they just have the biggest voice and they can talk a whole lot of nonsense and they get elected. So is there room for differing of opinion? You see, when you take to leadership, one thing I learned in my very early days when I started my leadership journey was that you don't go in there and ask for permission to, when you assume leadership, you don't come in as a leader and ask for permission to lead. You don't come in as a leader and ask for affirmation to lead. If you are in charge, be in charge. You're either in charge or you are not. So it doesn't matter whether there is room or they are providing you space to raise these issues. Hey, you raise them. You know, you go in there as a Black African woman. I cannot sit in these boards with an executives of white males. I have to ask the question of, where is the transformation here? Why are there no women leaders? Why is this not happening, right? It's a take, it's not a give. Because if you're gonna sit there and wait, and you see, this thing is also not a popularity contest. So if it means that in raising some of the questions, I'm going to piss some people off in the process, so be it. It's leadership. Grow a thick skin. No one is going to give it to you, you know? So I think it's really a function of understanding why you are there. You know, I am not naive to the fact that being a township girl who grew up under the circumstances that I grew up in Soweto, when someone like me ascends into a leadership position, there are many people that I don't know from a bar of soap who look at me and say, if we've got people like in leadership, maybe, just maybe, circumstances for us are going to change. Circumstances for us are going to change because she gets it. She's one of us. She comes from where we come from. So you never take the role model effect that you have as a leader, and you never take for granted that you are there to ensure that you drive the agenda of the majority. You are there to be on the right. You have only one chance to be on the right side of the truth. And as I'm saying, if you're going to piss people off in the process, so be it. So I think leaders need to understand that no room is going to be created for you, a space going to be created for you to raise issues that you need to raise, but you still raise them nevertheless. Thank you. There is hope. You see, if there wasn't hope, I don't think that any of us would be waking up in the morning, anymore. Why bother, right? So I have huge confidence in the active citizenry of South Africa. I've got huge confidence in the fact that you've got an independent media that can call it as they see it. I've got huge hope in the fact that I sit in a position of power. So even when someone won't do it, I will do it. I continue to raise the issues that I raise because I know that something is going to have to give, and it's going to have to give quickly. Because if something doesn't give, then South Africa is going to be another failed African state. And it will be a cold day in hell before South Africa gets there. So if it means that I raise some of the uncomfortable questions with this ANC-led government and with my own associates in business, then that is exactly what I'm going to do, because that is the burden of leadership. So that definitely is hope. I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to South Africa. I don't have any other country, Prof. This is the only, I don't have another passport city. So this country has to work. It really has to work.
So I do acknowledge that I see that some people had put something in the chat there, but we weren't really geared tonight to engage around that, and it would have just complicated things. But I certainly hope that whatever was put in the chat, other questions that may have been burning in your mind, I think that you heard tonight an answer to the question that you might have raised. So, Mavuso, thank you so much. I must just ask for your forbearance for another 5 minutes. As tradition goes, there's just a couple of things that we need to do. And Your Grace, I'm going to ask you to come and read the citation for the Responsible Leadership Essay Prize.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move there. I left my reading glasses. The top MBA Responsible Leadership Essay for MBA 2021 class was submitted by Lester Isaacs. Congratulations, Lester. The essay task required the students to prepare an advisory document on responsible business leadership, making use of their syndicate models of leadership to show how responsible leadership can be encouraged and inculcated within the organization of which they are a member. In his essay, Lester builds on the structure of the Cambridge Sustainable Leadership Model by integrating elements from other leadership theories, such as Ubuntu and transformational leadership, to create a very personal framework for his own future leadership responsibilities. He foregrounds the framework within the unique internal and external context currently facing an academic publishing business in the Eastern Cape. Using contingency theory, he critically examines his leadership role within this environment, highlighting self-awareness as the fundamental characteristic that should underpin several specific leadership actions. The framework emphasizes the importance of a cyclical, reflective approach towards achieving an evolving set of sustainable leadership goals. Congratulations, Lester.
Can I just ask you to stand there, please? So there's just 2 more things to do. So, Mr. Mavuso, I could ask you to please come forward and And Mrs. Makgoba, if you could please join us. This is a small token of appreciation from Rhodes University, which I'll ask our Vice Chancellor to hand over to you. A small token of appreciation from the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Development Trust. And I just ask the past president, his tradition to take the shirt. And going to give a vote of thanks. And it wouldn't be less if the shirt wasn't hanging out.
Thanks, Prof. Skay. The teachers have been telling me to tuck my shirt in since the first grade. Hasn't kicked in yet. Your Grace, Archbishop, Mrs. Makgoba, Vice Chancellor, Dr. Busisiwe, Mavuso, DVC, Peter Clayton, Deans, Prof. Skay, members of the clergy, and particularly our honored guest, Busisiwe Mavuso. It's a great honor for me as the elected president of the MBA class of 2021 to propose a vote of thanks. Some of the things that I'd like to take note of, we're at the end of our class, our course, and we're all excited about heading out back to our businesses and making a difference. And your lecture comes as a wake-up call, a reality call for all of us to say, you know, we see you as a leading light, somebody who has disdain for criminality and leadership, and who's out there fighting the good fight. But it's a wake-up call for all of us to say, what are we doing to create that inclusive social economic growth that our society so desperately needs? And there are political leaders here, future political leaders, there are educators here, and it's a wake-up call for all of us to say, what can we do in our small space? And we'll continue to follow you, your blog. So whatever spaces you find yourself in fighting the good fight, we are behind you, and keep going. Thank you very much.